There's this incredible fact about Ethiopia. It's the only nation in Africa that was never colonized. Ever wonder how that's possible? Well, that's the big puzzle that Donald Levine tackles in his book, Greater Ethiopia. And let me tell you, his work gives us a totally fresh way to look at this ancient, super complex, and just amazingly diverse country. So Levine's whole book, really, it boils down to this one massive question. How on earth did Ethiopia manage to hold off European colonial powers while pretty much the rest of the continent was being sliced up and divided? I mean, they didn't just put up a fight, they won. And to get to the bottom of that, we have to start by unpacking all the different and often totally contradictory ways the world has seen Ethiopia over the centuries. And what's so fascinating here is that for most of history, people have looked at Ethiopia through these four completely different and, often contradictory lenses. You'll see that these images, they often say more about the hopes and fears of the people looking in than they do about Ethiopia itself. But they're absolutely crucial for setting the stage for our story. Okay, so the first image, and we're talking ancient here, is this idea of Ethiopia as a land of incredible piety. Seriously, the ancient Greeks wrote about the blameless Ethiopians in their epic poems. The thinking was that their society was so just, so close to the divine, that the gods on Mount Olympus would literally leave home just to go feast with them. Now, this wasn't just some fairy tale. It really shaped how the entire ancient world viewed this part of Africa. Now let's jump forward to the medieval period and bam, the image completely flips. Suddenly, Ethiopia is the legendary land of Prester John. This mythical, unbelievably wealthy Christian king with a magnificent kingdom surrounded by non-believers. For European rulers, this guy was the ultimate dream ally for the Crusades. This idea, this myth, it fueled explorers from Portugal and put Ethiopia on the map, making it a real player on the world stage, even from way over there. But then, the picture gets a whole lot darker. Fast forward again to the 19th century. The scramble for Africa is in full swing, and a new image starts to take hold. Savage Abyssinia. European writers suddenly start describing the nation as cruel, backward, uncivilized. And this just goes to show you how powerful stories can be, right? This new image wasn't really about what was happening on the ground. It was a justification. It was basically a moral permission slip for colonialism. And that brings us to the fourth image, the one that just completely shattered that colonial narrative. In 1896, after defeating a modern European army at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia became something totally new. It became a beacon of hope, a powerful symbol of African strength and independence for freedom movements all over the continent, and really, for people of African descent everywhere. It was proof that resistance was not just possible, it was achievable. Okay, so we've got these four really powerful, but also really conflicting popular images, right? You'd think, okay, the academics, the scholars, they'll sort this all out. But for the longest time, even the scholarly views were kind of stuck in one of two very narrow and ultimately incomplete ways of looking at it. And this really lays out those two main academic traps perfectly. On the one hand, you've got the Semitic outpost theory. This one basically says that the real Ethiopia is only the northern highlands, the Semitic-speaking Christian part, and that its culture was just imported from Arabia. Everyone else? They're just kind of on the sidelines. Then, on the other hand, you have the ethnic museum view. This one looks at Ethiopia and just sees a random jumble of separate, isolated tribes with no real connection to each other. Now look, both of these views have a tiny grain of truth to them, but Levine argues they both miss something fundamental. They're classic cases of failing to see the forest for the trees. So, what if there's a completely different way to look at this whole story? And that brings us right to the heart of the book. Levine puts forward this new framework he calls Greater Ethiopia. And this right here is the key that unlocks that whole puzzle of how this nation managed to survive. So here's the crucial point. Greater Ethiopia, in Levine's view, isn't about a political empire. It's about a huge, ancient cultural area. For thousands of years, all the different peoples living here, speaking languages from different families like Cushitic, Semitic, Amadic, they weren't living in bubbles, not at all. They were part of this incredibly dynamic system, constantly interacting, trading, fighting, and sharing core cultural ideas. The bottom line is they were way more connected than they were separate. And you see, this just reframes everything. When you look at it this way, the expansion of the Ethiopian state wasn't just about conquering foreign tribes. It was more like an ingathering of peoples with deep historical affinities. That's how Levine puts it. It was a political unification happening inside a cultural world that already existed and was already connected. Okay, so if we accept that Ethiopia is this big interconnected zone, what's the engine that drove its history? What made it so unique? Well, Levine uses a pretty classic model to explain it: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's basically the story of two powerful, opposing cultures clashing, fighting, and eventually merging over hundreds of years. So let's break down the two big players in this historical drama. On one side, you've got the thesis. That's the traditional Amhara system. Think of it as hierarchical, very centralized with a king at the top, and a culture that really valued individual ambition. Then on the other side, you have the antithesis, the traditional Oromo system. This was completely different. It was deeply egalitarian, decentralized. They had what's called a redundant structure, which means power was spread out to make the system more resilient, and everything was built around group solidarity. I mean, two totally different ways of running a society. Now, for centuries, these two systems were pushing and pulling, expanding, clashing, and adapting to each other. And it's out of this long process of conflict and exchange between the Amhara model and the Oromo model that something brand new was forged: a political and cultural synthesis that was uniquely Ethiopian. It drew strength and resilience from both sides. And this dynamic, this is what gave the state the incredible ability to last for so long. So you might be asking, why does all this ancient history actually matter today? Well, in a later edition of his book, Levine connects this whole framework directly to the ethnic conflicts and the political challenges that have really defined modern Ethiopia. He points to three big things in the modern era that really fanned the flames. First, you had the central government getting much stronger and reaching deeper into people's everyday lives, which naturally created a lot of friction. Second, the country's influence on the world stage got weaker, which made the whole idea of separatism seem a lot more attractive to some. And third, and this might be the biggest one, the old ideologies that kind of held everything together, first the monarchy, then Marxism, they just collapsed. And that left this huge ideological vacuum, which got filled pretty quickly by ethnic nationalism. And this is where Levine's framework is so critical for understanding things today. You see, a lot of modern political narratives try to simplify this whole long history into a simple story of Amhara domination. But the reality that Levine shows us is so much more complex than that. He points to centuries of multi-ethnic rule and shared experience. You had Oromo generals and top officials in the old capital of Gondar. You had a coalition of people from all over who fought together at Adwa. The point is, the history is a shared one, not a separate one. And all of this leads to Levine's surprisingly hopeful conclusion. He basically says that if Ethiopians can embrace the shared, messy, complicated history, all of it, the good and the bad, they can actually find the tools they need to build their future. That same incredible solidarity and courage that it took to defeat a colonial army, well, that can be transformed into the solidarity and courage it takes to build a peaceful, democratic political process. Which really leaves us with a final, pretty powerful question to chew on. And this isn't just about Ethiopia, it's for any multi-ethnic society. How can a nation's complex, and let's be honest, often painful history, become a resource for building its future? How do you take all that messiness and turn it into a foundation for a shared, peaceful life together? That's really the essential challenge that this whole story leaves us with.